confusing story that maps onto reality, and that's why the central narrative is falling apart.
Right now in the United States, people should not be walking around with masks.
We must see the central narrative for the fiction that it is. We are Americans.
While elections are sometimes messy, this was a secure election.
The founders began the fight for human liberty and self-governance, and it's up to us to finish the job.
I tell you what, we are in a truth emergency right now.
This is the end game.
All the people that have gone out there against the mainstream media and said, you're going to call us racist, you're going to call us potential Timothy McVeighs, fuck you. War.
Immensely seductive. Quite sure he's right. An obsessionally neurotic. Pretty dangerous, in fact.
Do you mean you doubt your powers to convince him?
Worse than that. What I'm afraid of is his power to convince me.
Let us never tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories.
Say it! Say it!
All right, I'll say it.
Sweetheart, be reasonable.
All right. Well, here we are for another live stream. It is Tuesday, December 3rd, 2024, the 1413th day of dystopia. I'm your moderator, Chris Paul. Let's be reasonable. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining. Thank you for watching. Thank you for your support so far of this change in formats. I will be doing a subscriber stream tomorrow. I'll be doing Badlands Daily in the morning at 10 a.m. Eastern, and then I'll be doing my own show at 1 p.m. Eastern tomorrow, and then I'll be off Thursday and Friday, and I'll be back in the home studio starting next week. So the format will not return to how it was before exclusively, but we'll have some more of those episodes mixed in. Some people have been asking. So to clarify that, that's what will be happening. Let's start kind of a bit where we left off yesterday with the pardon of Hunter Biden, the appointment of Kash Patel, Trump's appointments in general. And then we're going to move on to some geopolitical stuff because there's so much happening. We're having another opportunity for all the based and red-pilled influencers to immediately act like they've been following geopolitics for the last 4 years when they haven't been doing that. They've just been saying, we are so back and trying to get Elon Musk's attention. It's kind of embarrassing. I think they're all waiting for Elon Musk to provide an X, formerly Twitter-based social incentive structure that shows them how they should be reacting to what's happening in South Korea. All they are ever able to do is say, the newspaper says this leader is communist and this one's not. Very smart, guys. Very smart. Worked so well in Venezuela that they have to try it again in South Korea. How is it going to work? It's anyone's guess. All right, let's go to X, formerly Twitter, and one of those based and red-pilled influencers who I'm sure is going to be exactly right on South Korea. This is Kyle Becker from yesterday. Special counsel rejects dismissal of Hunter Biden case after Joe Biden's pardon. In stunning legal motion, DOJ prosecutors are opposing Hunter Biden's request to dismiss his indictment rejecting the notion that a presidential pardon, wait a second, where are we? It seems like something might be incorrectly written here. Erases the charges against him. The defendant pled guilty to all the charges in the indictment on September 5th, 2024. Special counsel David Weiss's filing stated, according to the declaration filed on his behalf, the defendant again acknowledged his guilt in accepting the act of clemency. Prosecutors emphasized that Hunter Biden had not formally docketed the pardon, stating, if media reports are accurate, the government does not challenge that the defendant has been the recipient of an act of mercy, but that does not mean the grand jury's decision to charge him based on a finding of probable cause should be wiped away as if it never occurred. The filing also pushed back on Hunter Biden's claims of improper motives behind the charges, declaring it also does not mean that his charges should be wiped away because the defendant falsely claimed that the charges were the result of some improper motive. No court has agreed with the defendant on these baseless claims, and his request to dismiss the indictment finds no support in the law or the practice of this district. Special counsel's firm rejection underscores that the charges spanning tax crimes and gun violations are not erased by clemency. Prosecutors concluded unequivocally, for the foregoing reasons, the defendant's motion to dismiss the indictment should be denied. Hunter Biden's legal battles are not over yet, as prosecutors dispute the implications of his father's constitutionally dubious pardon. Okay, so that's what we're going to focus on, the constitutional dubiousness of it. And for anyone who's listening to this rather than watching, in that Kyle Becker tweet, or whatever they call it these days, ex post, the ex post facto, I suggested that to Elon. I haven't heard it called that yet, which is unfortunate because that's the best possible name for it. But in Kyle Becker's tweet, he posts that filing. Let's go to the New York Times. Actually, let's say hello to the chat. Hello, chat. There's not too many people in the chat yet, so we'll just wait on that. To the New York Times, Hunter Biden likely wouldn't qualify for a pardon recommendation under Justice Department criteria. So this was from Sunday evening. Hunter Biden likely would not have qualified for a pardon recommendation under the criteria used by the Justice Department's Office of the Pardon Attorney, which is tasked with identifying and vetting worthy clemency recipients. The office mostly recommends full pardons for people who have already served their sentences. How about that? So that was one of the branches of the Justice Department that we kind of read through yesterday. The Office of the Pardon Attorney. So that is the Justice Department recommending that presidents pardon people convicted, sentenced, and serving the sentence. Most have already served the sentence for federal crimes. And they are telling the president or advising the president on whose federal crimes to essentially erase. So Hunter Biden's federal crimes that shouldn't exist, as we noted, crimes regarding improper information in the filling out of gun purchase and registry forms and lateness on taxes. There should not be federal taxes on individuals, so there should not be federal tax crimes. There similarly should not be any crimes involving the documents related to the purchase of guns. There should be no documents related to the purchase of guns. The right shall not be infringed. Hunter Biden has not been sentenced, let alone served his sentence. Presidents have unchecked authority to grant clemency to anyone they choose, regardless of the pardon attorney's recommendations. So let us keep this in mind for future use. Something is being ceded to us, okay? Presidents have unchecked authority to grant clemency to anyone they choose, regardless of the pardon attorney's recommendations. We can imagine in the near future, anytime between, I guess now, and 4 years and 49 days from now, we will hear about how the DOJ's pardon attorney office would not suggest that Trump grant pardons in whatever circumstances they are attempting to delegitimize Trump's pardon over. During his first term in office, President-elect Donald J. Trump routinely granted clemency to people who had not been recommended by the pardon attorney, including to some who had been previously rejected by the office and others who had yet to be sentenced. Before Trump, reaching into the middle of an ongoing case to give a full pardon was almost unheard of, said Margaret Love, who ran the Justice Department's clemency process from 1990 to 1997 as the United States pardon attorney. Mr. Biden has been under pressure from groups supporting prisoners' rights to issue more clemency grants at the end of his term. In a statement issued after the announcement of Hunter Biden's pardon, Zoe Towns, the executive director of the advocacy group FWD.US, said, "It's time to prioritize clemency for thousands of vetted cases. The president has the opportunity to extend mercy to those serving disproportionately long sentences in federal prisons. We absolutely must turn our attention there." Well, Biden's not a real president. So sorry, Margaret, or Zoe, sorry. Sounds like it's not going to happen. The pardon attorney has received nearly 12,000 petitions for clemency during President Biden's term. Mr. Biden has so far issued 157 clemency grants, 25 pardons, which wipe out convictions, and 132 commutations, which reduce prison sentences, according to a tally kept by the pardon attorney. It is not clear if the tally includes the pardon to his son. Mr. Biden has issued fewer clemency grants so far than the 238, 144 pardons, 94 commutations issued by Mr. Trump during his first administration. And how about, let's see one of those requests for clemency. Let's go to Truth Social. This is, hold on. Let me get this straight here. What's happening? What is happening? Let's get back where we need to be here. I think I've messed it all up once again. You go to another page and the page you had marked just disappears. Then you have to find it again. And in the meantime, somebody's posted a zillion other posts you don't need. But here is my friend, Patriots in Control, with a post about one Stephen Colbert and a request for pardon. Last night, Stephen Colbert joked that Biden should pardon every late-night TV host. Given Colbert's ties to corrupt Democrats and his friendship with Pizzagate centerpiece John Podesta, this seems less like a joke and more like a desperate plea, and I will let you judge that for yourself.
Or you know what? You know what would be really funny? This would be really funny if Joe pardoned, like, every late-night host. And just because I think it would be a funny bit, I would accept that pardon.
You get it? It's really funny. It's funny because everybody knows that Stephen Colbert has said mean things about Donald Trump. He's made mean jokes about the mean orange man. And as a result of making those jokes, Stephen Colbert could be hypothetically imprisoned by Donald Trump for making jokes and just for making jokes. Because Donald Trump, he's a narcissist. He has such a fragile ego that he wants to punish late night talk show hosts and imprison them for their jokes. That is the implication here. Stephen Colbert couldn't have done anything else beyond that. He couldn't have been involved in an info operation designed to participate in the usurpation of the United States of America. For instance, there's no actual crimes he could have committed in coordination with the intelligence agencies that probably dictate what appears on these network television shows, and certainly have some sway over the talent agents and agencies and management companies and managers that represent talent like Stephen Colbert. So what do we make of all of that? Is Stephen Colbert actually panicking? Or is this just, is he just joking. Maybe he's just joking around. Maybe he thinks it's just good comedy and his fans will find it funny. Now, Stephen Colbert is, of course, one of the versions of Rachel Maddow, along with Chris Hayes and Mark Cuban and Keith Olbermann, who we discussed yesterday. We discussed Keith Olbermann because Keith Olbermann was talking about, let me see if I can find it, actually. Maybe I still have it up. No, I don't. Keith Olbermann was talking about how many people to pardon. He said potentially 10 million people would need pardoned. Anyone that Donald Trump might go after. Olbermann wanted to disrupt the retribution and revenge effort, and he thought that could be done by the fake President Joe Biden pardoning 10 million communists. Keith Olbermann has, I guess, a lot of people that he thinks might be guilty of crimes or somehow targeted and then imprisoned by the Trump administration, and that the fake President Joe Biden, who has not been a real president for even a single day, his pardon, his blanket pardon of 10 million would make it impossible for those people to be held accountable. It's weird, isn't it, that no one on our side ever asked for Donald Trump to pardon himself or his family members or anything, although that was a topic of some considerable conversation, and we'll get to that in just a second. But we weren't begging for clemency. The people even who were obviously targeted by their travel was targeted and restricted. They were debanked. They were censored, obviously in league with the federal elements of the federal government, in direct violation of not only human rights, but our constitutional rights. None of us asked for clemency from Donald Trump, fearing the communist regime, but these commies sure are scared. It's kind of crazy. I wanted to see what the limits on the president's power to pardon were. So I asked my friendly neighborhood artificial intelligence Perplexity. The president's power comes directly from the Constitution. Article 2, Section 2, Clause 1 of the U.S. Constitution grants the president, quote, power to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States, except in cases of impeachment. So offenses against the United States, federal crimes, of which there are probably far too many on the books. As we discussed yesterday, the number of federal crimes should not anywhere approach the number that there are. So maybe that would scale back Keith Olbermann's number somewhere below 10 million, perhaps. Maybe people like Stephen Colbert would not need pardoned because they would not then be guilty of violating the long list of federal crimes that has been put in place, despite what one might suspect were the goals of the founders, except those founders pushing for the massive sprawling federal government that the system they put in place would then create, and the massive federal court system, and thus the propagation of an endless string of federal laws and federal criminal laws that should probably not exist. So, did they violate all those? It's hard to say. Espionage and treason are among the legitimate federal crimes one would suspect if we are to have a federal government. So did they violate those? And that would be the real question. I'm not so worried about all these kind of low priority charges like the ones that Hunter Biden was tried for and convicted for committing. This constitutional provision establishes the president's broad authority to grant clemency, which includes not only pardons, but also other forms of relief from criminal punishment. The pardon power has its roots in English law. How about that? And was introduced at the Constitutional Convention by Alexander Hamilton. So we don't want British common law to be the foundation of our legal system. And it was not initially that. And the trial by jury, as outlined by Spooner seems to be a much better way to go about these things. You know, you should actually be guilty in the eyes of a jury of your peers who are also at the same time, they are trying the law itself, whether or not the law is legitimate and should be law, and that people should have their freedoms and their properties removed as a result of violating a law. If the law is going to be the law, then the people should stand behind the law and want to see people convicted for violating that law. And if you can't find a random jury of 12 of your legitimate peers not selected through a similarly ridiculous legal process, if they don't even think that the law should be a law, much less that you should be guilty of it, then not only should you not be found guilty, but it should not be a law. The Supreme Court has interpreted this power as plenary, meaning it is quite broad and generally not subject to congressional modification. However, there are some limitations on the pardon power. It only applies to federal offenses against the United States. It cannot be used in cases of impeachment. It cannot be used to pardon future crimes. It cannot violate other constitutional provisions or rights. Despite these limitations, the presidential pardon power remains a significant constitutional authority, allowing the president to grant mercy and further the public interest in matters of federal criminal justice. And that, of course, can be an important thing because it is a balance, a check on the power of the judiciary where the judiciary might err. And so there is some legitimacy there. Let us continue. This is the extremely commie think tank, the Brennan Center, telling us exactly how and why Donald Trump is always guilty. Presidential pardon power explained. Can the president pardon himself? Now, is Lauren Brooke Eisen actually Norm Eisen's daughter or potentially wife? This would be amazing. Let me just find. I have to seek this out now. Lauren Brooke Eisen wiki. Oh man. You know me, I just can't resist one of these. Gosh, I want to know if she is Norm Eisen's daughter. Maybe Perplexity will tell me. Gosh, that would be just delicious if she was the daughter of the author of the Color Revolution playbook. Is Lauren Brooke Eisen the daughter of Norm Eisen? Perplexity says it's like the magic 8-ball. Okay, so Lauren Brooke Eisen is not the daughter of Norm Eisen. Instead, she is the daughter of Ruthie Eisen and Charles Lee Eisen, as confirmed in a wedding announcement published in the New York Times. Okay, well, so then we can forego that comparison and connection. Obviously, there is none there. And let us continue forward. January 9th, 2021, 3 days after the very violent insurrection, the Constitution gives the president the power to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States, except in cases of impeachment. When it comes to reducing our prison populations, we've argued that this power should be used more frequently as a vital mechanism of mercy, tempering the often harsh, racist, and inequitable effects of our criminal legal system. But the pardon power also comes with the risk of abuse. Never has this been more apparent than under President Trump, who has used it to grant clemency to people convicted of crimes relating to his presidential campaign. And now Trump is reportedly considering trying to pardon himself for a variety of crimes, which would be unprecedented. So, no, he did never consider that. He never did it. He didn't have to do it. It has not come back in any way to bite him. In fact, it just helped to illustrate the illegitimacy of all the fake indictments brought against him. And you can see the Brennan Center immediately announcing that it was acceptable to violate their own principles in this case for the sake of democracy. For the same reason why it's okay to steal elections for the same reason why it's okay to violate the people's mandate that has been widely and recently expressed. It is okay for them to do anything they can to save democracy, including and especially violating the will of the overwhelming majority of people and thus democracy itself. Why is Trump considering pardoning himself? Sorry, I can't talk right now. The most recent reason is his role in inciting the deadly insurrection at the Capitol Wednesday, when he told a crowd of supporters in front of the White House that the election was stolen and instructed them to walk down to the Capitol. So insightful. It's still insightful, right? Where Congress was counting the Electoral College votes, the Justice Department said that it was not ruling out charging Trump for inciting a riot, with the U.S. Attorney in Washington saying, all options are on the table. We will look at every actor and all criminal charges. Since making that statement, the DOJ has softened its position, with one official calling it a moonshot that there's any hook for criminal liability for Trump. But then, of course, Jack Smith created one. Fakely. But even if Trump dodges prosecution now, nothing will stop the Biden DOJ based on its review of the law and facts from prosecuting Trump for inciting the riot. That's amazing. Before the fake president ever took fake power, they were already announcing that the Biden DOJ would be ready to prosecute Trump. And Biden's Attorney General pick, Merrick Garland, condemned Wednesday's riots and noted that today's priorities, from ensuring racial equality in our justice system to meeting the evolving threat of violent extremism, are ones that he will be devoted. Okay. The other recent reason is election interference, illegal election interference, specifically Trump's January phone call to Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, in which the president asked him to find 11,780 votes to change the outcome of the presidential vote in the state. And of course, that was a perfect phone call. News of the call prompted Ted Lieu and Kathleen Rice to ask the FBI to open a criminal investigation into the matter, saying they believe the president has engaged in solicitation of or conspiracy to commit a number of election crimes. Obviously not true. Back in 2017, the Washington Post reported that Trump consulted with his advisors on the legal authority to self-pardon when he was under investigation by special counsel Robert Mueller as part of the Russia probe. And that is exactly the same as doing it, apparently. It is really unbelievable. These people are unbelievable. That Georgia phone call was, of course, the perfect phone call. And if you have not listened to the full phone call yourself, I suggest you do that. You will realize that it was the perfect phone call. And you will realize that Trump's request for nearly 12,000 votes, the number necessary to overturn the election, was after a long string of evidence that Georgia's election the election results were the product of fraud and manipulation and abuse. And it was no problem whatsoever to understand that there were hundreds of thousands of fake or fraudulent votes in Georgia's election. And so what Trump did was just ask Raffensperger to simply choose one of the baskets of fraud. There are all of these fraudulent votes. We don't need you to go after all of them right now. Just choose one that has 12,000 votes roughly in it and present that. And at that point, we can simply overturn the results of this fake election in Georgia, and that'll be all we need. And if you've been following along with Hindsight 2020, my show on Monday nights on Badlands, you will understand that over the last 4 weeks now, since the fake election of 2020, as we go through 2020's timeline, we have gone through example after example after example of fraud and the opportunities for Governor of Georgia, Brian Kemp, to have called a special session to make sure to produce the ballot envelopes with the signatures so that it could be seen by everyone that there was no legitimacy in the election results in Georgia. And of course, legitimacy was not a possibility in Georgia's fake elections because, as we've noted countless times, Curling v. Raffensperger was already on the books before the fake election of 2020. And it is clear in that case from the expert evidence that the voting systems, the electronic voting machines, are incapable of producing real and verifiable results, and therefore all elections in Georgia are null and void since that time. And it's kind of the people's responsibility to understand that that was proven nearly 5 years ago and to do something about it. And if people continue not to care and they continue to bend over and fall to their knees and supplicate and grovel before power, waiting for the government to correct itself, despite all incentives not to, we will be here forever. And perhaps that's our fate. So they go through, could Mike Pence pardon Trump if he resigns or is removed from office by impeachment or under the 25th Amendment? Yes, he could. So the idea would be then that Trump would want to 25th Amendment himself. He would accept that perhaps, or the impeachment that followed after Trump was already no longer president. And at that point, then Pence would be able to save Trump's hide. And Trump, of course, always self-interested, would have pursued those routes, allowed those routes to be pursued so that he could then be pardoned and not be imprisoned for the rest of his life. That was the threat over Trump. Would a presidential self-pardon be constitutional? The answer is unclear. While neither the text of the Constitution nor judicial precedent explicitly resolves the matter, a 1974 Justice Department memo contended that a self-pardon would collide with the fundamental rule that no one may be a judge in his own case. So it's okay to jail Trump and to see his self-pardon as illegitimate based on a Justice Department memo. The only way to answer this question then is for Trump to pardon himself and subsequently be indicted for a federal crime for which he had pardoned himself. That in turn would create the opportunity for the courts to settle the debate. Oh, how about that as a preview of what might be to come? The only way to answer this question then is for Biden to pardon himself and subsequently be indicted for a federal crime for which he had pardoned himself. That in turn would create the opportunity for the courts to settle the debate. And if we see Joe Biden pardon himself, the fake president pardon himself, then we will see the court get to pantomime that through that case and come to the conclusion about whether or not a president can pardon himself. I mean, all of this is probably moot because the illegitimacy of these bodies and the lack of necessity for this particular issue to be resolved. I have a feeling that the shape of much of this is going to change in the future. And this will be, it will obviate the need to settle this. But there's a possible route in case it has to happen. How would a self-pardon affect state prosecutions? The Constitution only grants the ability to pardon people of federal crimes. So even if the court found that the president could pardon himself, it would not excuse him from violations of state laws, several of which he is in danger of being prosecuted for. And so they go through Raffensperger, they go through Fulton County, they go through Letitia James, Cy Vance, the Trump Organization. I mean, that's basically the whole thing, isn't it? Those are the prosecutions. Alvin Bragg took over for Cy Vance. Letitia James actually did her own. Fulton County did their own. And then we had the federal prosecutions from Jack Smith based on the attempts to overthrow or overturn the election and cause January 6th. So this is, by the way, why I thought when I looked at the names of the authors that Laura Brooke Eisen might be Norm's daughter, because Norm Eisen at the Brookings Institution essentially wrote the white papers on which all of those Trump prosecutions were based. So to have previewed that to the Brennan Center, especially to his own daughter, would have been no surprise. But as stated, she is not his daughter. So sometimes it's fun to look at the case that the communists make, the elite communist think tanks make against Donald Trump, because the reversal of that is a hint toward what we might see in the future on the other side. we're going to see those arguments play out, but in the direction they never expected. And it's because those things need to be settled in the cases where they do, obviously. Will we see Joe Biden pursue any of these routes? Because Joe Biden may well still be charged with and convicted for federal crimes, including potentially treason. Or it's possible that, very likely with Hunter, very likely as with Hunter, I should say, Joe Biden may have gone state's evidence, become a confidential informant, or may have just been the most badass undercover double agent of all time. I have great suspicion about that being true. I don't believe that is true. But man, we are in a weird, weird world. And to assume that it can't be true is not something I would want to do. I mentioned Jack Posobiec's tweet yesterday about whether or not Joe Biden had actually signed the pardon. No one has seen a video of him signing it. No one has seen a video of him explaining it, Posobiec noted. And I still think that is the case. So all we have are words on pages that could be generated by anyone and simply disseminated, causing people to believe it all. Posobiec also on Sunday tweeted, or not tweeted, well, I'm sure he tweeted it as well, but he posted it on Telegram. He posted it on Truth. Over Thanksgiving, Hunter told his father about a book he was writing that would go public with everything. Days later, his father signed a blanket pardon. He says this is per a White House official. So that suggests that Hunter was going to tell the world everything he knows that would be detrimental to Joe Biden. And it is what forced Joe Biden's hand in pardoning his son. We're meant to believe that Joe Biden being exposed to new risk by his own son was the justification for this presidential pardon. Joe Biden was worried. He wanted to save his own hide. Therefore, he pardoned his son. And of course, similar narratives about Donald Trump, about Trump Jr., Eric Trump, Jared Kushner, all of the people that could ever have some criminality suggested for them that would then imply some criminality of Donald Trump. Trump would want to pardon them and thereby pardon himself and reduce his exposure to risk. So we're seeing all of that. Those narratives we saw before now reversed, and we might see the flip back of these same notions against Biden used against Trump again, just this never-ending series of reruns and reversals. We've become accustomed to these sorts of things. These sorts of patterns are important to notice when they happen. It's not necessarily predictive. Okay. I don't know if these are going to be right. It's just something to look for in the future, because when we see the rerun, we can understand it's part of this pattern. And then we can look back to prior instances of that pattern and have some guidance about where the future issues might go and what the basis for conversation is and was. Checking in with the chat just momentarily. Coffee Lady says she likes the live streams, love the video with the audio. Thank you. Yeah, some people like them and some people like the other format, and I totally get it. And there are advantages to both formats as far as I'm concerned. This allows me to cover a lot more territory, a lot more quickly, and allows me to have some instant feedback that I like. It also allows me to have all of this on video, which I guess is helpful for people when they clip things and share things. And my audience doesn't do that a whole lot. And honestly, guys, if there's stuff that you hear and you're not able to convince someone in your life or someone in your kind of social media circle to listen to a 2-hour-long podcast, which I totally get, especially because a lot of people still think of a show's popularity as part of that show's credentials. Like if it's not a big show and it hasn't gotten into the mainstream, then it's probably not worth watching, right? If it was a good enough show, it would break into the mainstream and then it would be worth watching. And then they could listen to a person like me and maybe care about what I have to say. And that, unfortunately, is just how our information space has evolved to be over the last 10 or 15 years with social media dominating everything. You can understand it and still reject it. It's a bad way for things to be judged. It is not a suggestion of merit that a show is popular. It is only a suggestion of regime approval and regime pushing the show to be popular. If a show is able to be popular or increase in popularity in censored spaces while other people were censored, you can understand that it is a beneficial show to the regime, and that is why it's elevated. And for instance, the Daily Weimar gets huge notoriety and popularity and an influx of cash and these very glossy studio presentations while other people are censored. Same with Tucker Carlson and Bongino and the rest of them. And maybe it's all very helpful white hat info op, but maybe it's not. Maybe it's just people exploiting and taking advantage of censored information spaces and creating a new alternative mainstream media, which is exactly what it seems to be. So to have tracked that the entire time with the potential for that to be the consequence, and that then to obviously be what has emerged in reality, it might be time to maybe consider that that's what's going on rather than the constant protection of the television characters. So Barely says you're improving at producing these now that you're doing them regularly. Thanks for the efforts. Thank you. I hope I am. The problem is that I'm never going to produce them well enough to make them look like those presentations. Maybe when I get home, it's going to look a little better. I'm not sure there's a whole lot I can do at this particular location with the amount of resources that I have right now to devote to something like that. But in the future, obviously, I'm conscious of these things, and I understand that presentation is one of those kind of unfortunate necessities, maybe. I'm of a couple minds about that. We'll just see how things evolve. Hopefully, we won't need to make too many adjustments, but we shall see. In another 50 days, there will be another one of those inflection points, and things will kind of split in a couple different ways down a couple different lines. And maybe things will change in ways that alleviate these concerns. This is The Hill from Sunday morning. So this is the morning after Kash Patel is nominated, or Trump says Kash Patel will be nominated as FBI director, and before Hunter Biden was pardoned on Sunday evening. John Bolton compares Kash Patel to Soviet secret police leader. These people are insane. I mean, whatever. It's kind of hilarious. I want to see, actually, before we get into this, whether I can find Trump talking about John Bolton over the last few weeks, or maybe the few weeks leading up to the election. Oh, wonderful. I found it. Here's one of them. Trump talking about Bolton with Tucker Carlson. So we'll just pause on the Hill article for now. Here we are.
Bolton, see again, you get back. Bolton, a real dope. But I thought he'd be great because he was so stupid. He was like a boiler. Every time, if somebody shot down a little tiny crappy drone that cost about $15, he'd want to go to war with Russia. I said, no, I think he was great for me, though, for a period of time because he was a nut job, and everybody, I could see his face get red with that stupid white mustache, and he'd be ready to explode. And this was good for me. I went to Kim Jong-un in North Korea. I took this moron with me, and he never said anything. But when Kim Jong-un saw him, he said, oh, shit, I think the guy wants to go to war. So he was great for me to negotiate with. The same thing with Russia. You know, when Putin saw him, I'd be very nice. I'd say, hi, Vladimir, how you doing? And then Putin's, 2 rows back, and it'd see that moron, and it'd say, holy shit, this guy wants to go to war with me. And I got a lot of what I wanted.
So there is Donald Trump suggesting that the relationship with John Bolton was so productive on the Trump side because Trump was not listening to his advice or going along with what John Bolton wanted. He actually used John Bolton as a heel or a foil. And just Bolton's presence made it seem like Trump wanted to go to war because John Bolton is such a deranged militant neocon, at least to the extent that his public persona is representative of who John Bolton really is. Now, it's funny because Donald Trump could be using the exact same dynamic he's describing to influence the minds of his audience, the American public, us, by saying, I'm using John Bolton to create a false impression about what I'm doing. Is he using John Bolton, this description of John Bolton, to create a false impression of what John Bolton is? Maybe John Bolton is a better guy than we know. Now, I don't think that's the case. I'm just suggesting it as a possibility. Here is that Hill article. Let's see what John Bolton has to say about Kash Patel. Former National Security Advisor John Bolton compared Kash Patel, President-elect Trump's nominee to head the FBI, to one of the former Soviet Union's most feared secret police chiefs, Lavrentiy Beria. Trump has nominated Kash Patel to be his Lavrentiy Beria, Bolton said in a statement to NBC News' Meet the Press on Sunday. Fortunately, the FBI is not the NKVD. The Senate should reject his nomination 100-0. Well, okay. I guess we'll see if they do. Now, it's important to understand that John Bolton's global communism, he is a neoconservative downstream from Trotsky. He is literally the exact person, essentially, that he's warning against. So I guess not literally, but that would be crazy if he was literally that person. NKVD refers to the Interior Ministry and Secret Police of the Soviet Union, which was in place from 1934 to 1946. Beria was appointed by former Soviet Union Prime Minister Joseph Stalin as deputy chief of the Soviet Secret Police and was the head of the Soviet atomic bomb project. According to the Atomic Heritage Foundation, he is known for his violent tactics, including kidnapping, torture, and rape, which he used to advance within the ranks of the secret police. At the time, Soviet leaders reportedly feared that Beria would use his control of the secret police to fully seize power. Beria was later tried and convicted of treason and was executed in Moscow in 1953. So that's the comparison. That's who we're supposed to imagine Kash Patel is. I mean, man, I guess it's possible that Kash Patel isn't the good guy we all think he is, but he's that guy? That does not seem right at all. Now, I mean, I am not a Soviet historian that has any knowledge whatsoever of how Lavrentiy Beria was. I have to assume or judge this on the Hill's description of him. On that description of him, that sounds absolutely insane. Like there's no way that could possibly be a description of Kash Patel. But that is where we are now. So Bolton suggests that Kash Patel should be rejected 100-0. Let's go through some of that New York Times article that I mentioned yesterday on the Senate's confirmation process. The headline from, what was it, Sunday. A second Trump term poses a crucial test of the Senate's independence. I mean, what? It is not a test of the Senate's independence. It's being framed as the purpose of the other branches of government. It's not that they're to provide a check and balance on presidential power, generally speaking. It's that they're there to provide a check and balance on presidential power when it's the wrong kind of president. And they should also check and balance the judiciary when it's the wrong kind of judiciary. It's like all the bodies within the constitutional form of government exist to make sure the regime's form of government is maintained in the United States. And I was going to go through a little something that talked about that today. And actually, let's jump to that for just a second. Apologies. I'm going to go once again to the philosopher, the neo-reactionary philosopher, Nick Land. I've been reading his book, Xenosystems. And while I don't agree, I believe, with some of the foundational claims of Land's philosophy, because I think that he is a little bit too dependent on scientific materialism, perhaps, and while understanding its problems, and potentially also on the ideas of non-overlapping magisteria that would flow from a focus on scientific materialism. Like he thinks, it seems to me halfway through Xenosystems that Nick Land is committed to the view that discussions of God are not useful in political or societal discussions because they are incapable of becoming universal. And I think maybe that is a mistake. If God exists, then God is universal. And so the universality is a necessary quality of God's existence. And therefore, to bar that from conversations based on the idea that people have different religious beliefs and therefore you're kind of in the realm of opinion doesn't actually make any sense as far as I'm concerned. I'll probably have to flesh that out more in the future. But so Nick Land is referencing, this is an entry in Xenosystems called The Red Pill. And I'm not going to go through all of this, but he's talking about Curtis Yarvin here, who writes under the name Mencius Moldbug and is kind of the forefather of neo-reactionary philosophy of neo-reaction. Moldbug's most recent invocation of the red pill runs: I think I've chosen my candidate for the pill itself, and I'm going to stick with it. My pill is America is a communist country. What I like about this statement is that it's ambiguous. Specifically, it's an Empsonian ambiguity of the second or perhaps third type. I've never quite understood the difference. Embedded as it is in the mad tapestry of 20th century history, America is a communist country can be interpreted in countless ways. All of these interpretations, unless concocted as intentional, obviously idiotic straw man, are absolutely true. Sometimes they are obviously true, sometimes surprisingly true. They are always true because America is a communist country. And this is a conclusion that I have reached kind of gradually over the last few years. I have understood, obviously you can go back and listen to the podcast, since my awakening in 2020, that there was a communist element in America and a communist element worldwide that was striving to take over the world in no uncertain terms, and they weren't afraid to admit it. But we were all afraid to admit it because, you know, you get accused of red baiting or engaging in the Red Scare, or you would hear about how dangerous it was to talk about the communists. And that, of course, is because communism is an essential part of the globalist ideology and the global Zionist ideology. And so therefore, you know, claims of communism would be called claims of anti-Semitism and all these other things. And then, of course, you would be violent, and then you would want to be imprisoning people, and you would want to be punishing thought and all these other things. It turns out that there just is a movement toward global communism. The neo-reactionaries are clear about that. And Yarvin is clear that America is itself a communist country. I kind of moved gradually my understanding of global communism, from my understanding of global communism to the understanding that California was a communist state in itself, and now to a more kind of holistic agreement that America is a communist country. Let's just go through the rest of this. This is now Land writing. That was Yarvin. The truth is that America serves the people through the lie. That is the quote unquote choice represented by progressivism, which equals communism. And of course that does. Progressivism is just communism, installed in a highly accomplished state for over a century. as triumphant popular self-deception. They are right about all of that. They are right about that, particularly through that World War II period and what has followed now with the advance of popular culture. We are told America is something that it clearly is not. And with all the pride that we are meant to embrace in the telling of that story, we are also meant to embrace the understanding of everything foundational and constitutional as its own inversion, which is crazy. The service provided and demanded is the deceit. If the people see through the lie, the resulting dissatisfaction will not stem from the fact that they have been lied to, but from the revelation that they have not been lied to well enough. Could anything be clearer than that? The outbreaks of popular rage occur exactly at those moments when reality threatens to manifest itself, when the matrix glitches. We elected you to hide the truth from us, the people shriek. So just do your goddamn job and make reality disappear. End quote. Quoting the people there, hypothetically. There is no red pill to save society. To imagine that there might be is to understand nothing. And that is where Land and I would depart, of course, because I think that the existence of God and the necessity of serving God, that's the red pill that can go beyond the point where Nick Land's reason begins, in my estimation, to fail him. So let's reapproach this New York Times article with that being quite clear that America is a communist country, and the instruments of power within the American government are expected by all the other instruments of power in our society to be wielded in service of the preservation of America as a communist country in the advancement of the global communist regime and its agenda. Okay, so we're talking about now the Senate being a check on presidential power, and we are having it declared for us that this is its important constitutional role. With Mr. Trump putting forward a raft of contentious prospective nominees and threatening to challenge congressional authority in other ways, Republicans who will hold the majority come January could find themselves in the precarious position of having to choose between standing up for their institution or bowing to a president dismissive of government norms. The clearest and most immediate point of tension is likely to be Mr. Trump's efforts to skip the Senate's traditional confirmation process to install loyalists, including some with checkered backgrounds in his cabinet. And so now, of course, we're led to believe that Kash Patel has a checkered background, assumedly based on his opinions. But the president-elect has also, and of course, they would say, to steelman their point, they're talking about the accusations against Matt Gaetz and Pete Hegseth. And we are just supposed to accept those allegations as true and then assume that Gaetz and Hegseth actually do have checkered pasts. But the president-elect has also signaled he expects Republicans on Capitol Hill to accede to his wishes on policy, even if it means ceding Congress's control over federal spending. And of course, that is just about Donald Trump refusing to spend money that the Congress has allocated for future spending so that they could tie Trump's hands on policy and his ability to remove agencies, his ability to affect foreign policy, etc. Both are powers explicitly given to the legislative branch in the Constitution. And so the idea here being that Trump will be violating the Constitution somehow if he doesn't do the bidding of regime communists in American government. Lawmakers and analysts say allowing Trump to erode the Senate's authority to pass judgment on nominees by sidestepping it through recess appointments or watered-down background checks could do permanent damage to the Senate and undermine the constitutional system. Well, No, except in the eyes of these sorts of people who view the Constitution and the instruments and bodies of government under that Constitution as their tools to maintain and advance their own system. It is the central pillar in the checks and balances system, said Ira Shapiro, a former longtime Senate staffer and author of 3 books on the institution. There's nothing more central to the Senate's role than the advice and consent authority. Well, that can't possibly be true because the federal government was nowhere near this size at the time the Constitution was written. And many people thought it would never become anything like this. So it can't then be possible that the Senate's key role was the advice and consent role for presidential appointments to offices that didn't exist at the time and probably couldn't have been predicted to exist. Very, very crazy. He and others were heartened by the Senate resistance that led to the withdrawal of former Representative Matt Gaetz as a candidate for Attorney General, the election of Senator John Thune of South Dakota as the incoming majority leader, despite a MAGA-driven campaign to reject him and install Senator Rick Scott of Florida, a diehard Trump acolyte, was also seen as a sign that some Senate Republicans were not ready to capitulate to Trump. Okay, that is a perspective on what happened. Another perspective would be that Senate resistance had absolutely nothing to do with Gaetz's withdrawing of his nomination. It was an obvious info op. J.D. Vance doing a photo shoot with Matt Gaetz. Look, I'm taking Matt Gaetz to meet senators. Oh, they don't like him. Now Matt Gaetz is withdrawing his name. And he's just going to serve somehow in some different capacity in the future. So silly. And install Rick Scott of Florida. They weren't going to install him. They were simply going to vote for him. Is he a diehard Trump acolyte? He is in the telling of the regime, but in the eyes of MAGA, that's not remotely close to true. He is a minimally acceptable MAGA senator insofar as the Senate could possibly be MAGA. It's like the lowest possible bar to cross. But Mr. Thune's election was by secret ballot, and Mr. Gaetz likely represented just the first, not the last, effort by Mr. Trump and his allies to bring the Senate to heel. So now the appointment of Matt Gaetz as Attorney General, the declared appointment of Matt Gaetz as Attorney General, is an effort to bring the Senate to heel. That doesn't even begin to make sense. It means nothing. But of course, it has to be said in the venerated pages of the New York Times in order to promote the idea that there is somehow a contest here and the Senate are the protectors of democracy, Trump, the attacker of democracy. The prospect of a constitutional clash between Republican senators, a president of their own and a president of their own party, and of course, New York Times has typos sometimes too, originated with Mr. Trump's call for Senate leaders to embrace so-called recess appointments, a disputed practice of installing nominees when the Senate is on a break to circumvent resistance and accelerate the approval of his candidates. So Trump is not allowed to use the tools available to him because he is the wrong kind of president. That idea immediately set off alarms with some Senate Republicans who see their advice and consent role as defined in Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution as one of their defining responsibilities. Several of them said they intended to do what they could to preserve it. Senator Mitch McConnell of Kentucky, the outgoing Republican leader, has signaled he may be one of them. And they go through how Senator Susan Collins thinks this would be violating the intent of the founders. We would be ignoring specific language in the Constitution. Okay. Well, you might recall that a different argument was made probably in these very pages of the New York Times back when they were considering Barack Obama's Supreme Court nominee, Merrick Garland. They were very, very upset. They were saying that Mitch McConnell was somehow overriding the president's prerogative to nominate a Supreme Court justice. So apparently the roles were different back then. So they're talking about recess appointments and the division here, what the Senate is able to do and should be able to do, always, of course, under the Constitution. In recent years, we're skipping ahead now. In recent years, debates over the Senate's singular role has focused on whether to preserve the filibuster, the 60-vote supermajority required for most legislation that is enshrined in the chamber's rules. That's a rule. That is not part of the law. It's just in the chamber's rules. The threshold for nominations was reduced to simple majority in 2013, and some on the left have argued it should be weakened further to allow action on major legislation, such as a measure to preserve voting rights. How about that? We need a measure to preserve voting rights, and it's such major legislation and so important that the Senate's filibuster must be weakened even further beyond a simple majority. I guess you do whatever you have to preserve democracy. But Democrats warn that what Mr. Trump has in mind would do far more to damage the Senate, far more damage to the Senate. The filibuster is not in the Constitution, said Michael Bennet, Democrat of Colorado. Advise and consent is. And the responsibilities we have as a legislative branch are constitutionally prescribed there. They are important and were written just for moments like this. Are they? Are they really? Others caution that history has shown that once a change in Senate practice is allowed, it becomes permanent as the party out of power eventually returns to majority status and seeks the same advantage. Do we need parties? No. Were there founders who didn't want parties? Yes. So could the Constitution have been written to stymie one party or another in a two-party system? Highly unlikely. Others caution that history has shown that once a change in Senate practice is allowed, it becomes permanent as the party out of power eventually returns. Oh, sorry, I just read that. Jeez. When you open the barn door, it is really hard to get the horse back in, said Sarah Binder, an expert on Senate procedure who teaches at George Washington University. She said that allowing Mr. Trump to skirt the traditional confirmation process could also weaken the Senate's claim to its power to conduct oversight of federal agencies and to hold the executive branch accountable. The fight is over more than just whether Mr. Trump will try to dodge the Senate completely. Some Republicans are insisting that Mr. Trump's picks undergo standard FBI background checks before being voted on, a requirement that his transition so far has refused to agree to, and which advisors have suggested he should sidestep. Other Senate Republicans embracing the president-elect's skepticism of the FBI say checks by the law enforcement agency aren't crucial. And so there you have a bit of the leverage play here, which is we are not going to consent to your nominations. We are not going to vote to consent to your nominations unless they go through the FBI background check process as we have prescribed, or through some of the background checks of other agencies that they are comfortable aligning with, so that they get the information and they can use that process then to corrupt and compromise different nominees, and their vote will be the leveraging factor. I don't think the American public cares who does the background checks. Senator Bill Hagerty, Republican of Tennessee, said on ABC's This Week, what the American public cares about is to see the mandate that they voted in delivered upon. And that's the standard right there. I mean, if they want to deny that Donald Trump has a mandate from the people, they should deny that. And certain people are denying that, as we saw yesterday with David Frum. He suggested that this was the smallest popular vote win. So in, I think he said recent history or some considerable history, whatever. He is denying that Donald Trump has the mandate in the first place, but at least make the argument that Donald Trump doesn't have a mandate and try to sell that to the public. And of course, if you try to sell that to the public, you're not going to be very successful because everybody can tell that Donald Trump has a mandate. In an effort to hold the Senate in line, Mr. Trump's allies have promised to exact political retribution for any who loom as obstacles to the new administration by inciting primary opposition when they next appear on the ballot. But Republicans resisted the blitz against Mr. Thune for leader, and Ms. Murkowski, one of the Republicans most likely to break with Mr. Trump, said she would be willing to do so without fear of the political consequences if she found nominees objectionable. Well, that is because Ms. Murkowski is entirely under control by the regime. She is a loyal servant of the Uniparty, and everyone was privy to her picture, to seeing that illustrated in photographic form with Dianne Feinstein, or is it Feinstein? I think it's Feinstein, Dianne Feinstein, looming over her. Here is that picture. Always a wonderful go-to. You'll remember this. Just them in the hallway. Dianne Feinstein or Stein, looking, honestly, aside from her diminutive stature, kind of mannish there. Anyway, she looks like she is threatening Murkowski, and Murkowski is explaining like a cowed schoolgirl, looking very, very intimidated. And they go on with, they conclude, I should say, this way: as the new administration assumes control, both the House and the Senate are likely to face other challenges to their fundamental authority, including assertions by some in Trump's inner circle that the administration is not bound to spend money, even if Congress appropriates it for a designated purpose. And again, we're talking about the Impoundment Act and rescission. Donald Trump has promised not to spend that money. So we're going to see fights over this. And they are, trying to use these fights that they will lose as part of a bigger picture to suggest that Donald Trump is far overstepping his constitutional authority as president under the original Constitution, not their, kind of abomination Constitution that they now operate under. And they're going to use that argument to build the case that Donald Trump is doing everything in an anti-constitutional way and that he should probably be impeached, or that it is right and just, it's a necessity to usurp his power through a coup or whatever else. We're going to about to see more on that. But lawmakers expect that the handling of nominees in the early days of the Trump administration will be telling about the Senate's future. Chris Coons, Democrat of Delaware, Joe Biden groveling servant, says if we allow recess appointments to fill the entire Trump cabinet without confirmation hearings, we take away one of the most important tools senators have. Whether or not the Senate can be the institution that our framers intended is going to be proven one way or the other here in the next 2 months. And once again, bring it on. You love to see it. Nothing wrong with that. Give us the biggest and best version. Gieserman says Stein, not Steen. Okay. I'll take your word for it. Let's go to coups of different varieties, and we discussed this a little bit on Devolution Power Hour on Saturday night. Devolution Worldwide, this is the Wall Street Journal this would be Friday's Wall Street Journal. Bolsonaro is making a comeback bid in Brazil and betting on Trump's help. So Brazilian devolution, and let me see if I can just, before we start this, find Brazilian QAnon shaman, because you will remember that Brazil had its own QAnon shaman. It was a different day. It was not on their very violent insurrection on January 6th, though they did have one of those too. Let's just check on Brazil's QAnon shaman quickly. Here he is in all his horned glory with a megaphone. And that is just another visual cue that is meant to tell everybody, hey, look, we are running the same info op down in Brazil that we are running here in America. All right. And people don't think that the American very violent insurrection was an info op or that it was staged or whatever. There are some people who think it wasn't staged on any level. There are some people who think it was real but infiltrated. There are some people who think that it was staged on some level. And then there are, of course, some people who believe that it was staged on all levels, despite people getting caught up in the reality of the event, because it was a kinetic event. It was happening in the real world. It does not take away from the fact that the event was an info op and a psyop, that organic elements mixed themselves into the psyop. Okay, that is why these things are promoted. They are begging people to come introduce themselves into the kinetic act. And that is why Donald Trump brought people into it, so that it couldn't be the presentation that the regime intended and was instead presented in another way. Okay, so let's go back to the Wall Street Journal. Jair Bolsonaro, former president of Brazil, wants to return to power and said he believes U.S. President-elect Donald Trump will help make that happen, possibly by using economic sanctions against the current president, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. Okay, now Lula da Silva is Brazil's Joe Biden. They're talking about economic sanctions. That means that the global fiat bankers will be waging economic warfare against Brazil. Now, that was always going to happen. Brazil is the B in BRICS. Brazil is united in a currency coalition with China, Russia, South Africa, and India. If you're in a currency coalition that accounts for more than half the world's economy and more than half the world's population, and you're going to be trading in resources with other nations of the world refusing to use the regime's fiat dollar, the regime's going to be very mad. That is their number one tool, or their number one necessary tool. The number one tool ultimately would be military, but they don't have that. Banned, it doesn't seem they have, I should say. Banned from running for office until 2030 and facing criminal charges for allegedly plotting a coup, Bolsonaro said he sees Trump's election as a game changer for his future and politicians on the right in Latin America. Leftists have recently won presidential elections in Mexico and Uruguay and govern most large countries in the region. And the whole leftist distinction in South America at this point is absurd. I bet they will be calling Donald Trump and his supporters leftists and communists within the next 10 years. So it's regime or not regime. It's good twin, evil twin, and nothing else in my mind. Okay. These descriptions of leftists and communists are nonsense. They call Maduro a communist dictator. And as we'll see, we're going to touch on Maduro in just a second. But Maduro is anti-regime, and his identity by the regime as a communist is irrelevant. And we shouldn't just accept that identity. So we got Bolsonaro banned from running. They tried that with Trump. Facing criminal charges. They tried that with Trump. Allegedly plotting a coup. They tried that with Trump. Okay. Continuing down. Da Silva's leftist government, which considers Bolsonaro an authoritarian figure, they tried that with Trump, declined to comment on the former president's assertions. A spokesperson for Trump's incoming administration didn't respond to a request for comment. Okay, the former president in this case is Bolsonaro, the Brazilian Trump, pictured there with Trump. Bolsonaro, who is president of the world's fourth most populous democracy from 2019 through 2022, has been one of Trump's closest foreign allies, sharing similar views on the culture wars and scorn for the political left and the media. The two men deepened ties when their presidencies overlapped in 2019 and 2020. The two presented a united front against Venezuela's authoritarian leader, Nicolas Maduro. Okay. And this is going to be key in some sense, because this is just optics. All right. Just optics. And they mean by that Donald Trump recognized Juan Guaido as the legitimate leader of Venezuela. And we have discussed that countless times at this point. Guaido was never the legitimate leader of Venezuela. He was never the president of Venezuela. He never acted as president, never served as president. And eventually, countries that had recognized him as president simply stopped recognizing him as president. There's nothing else we need to know about Guaido's legitimacy and the fact that we can have a false reality government presented directly on top of a real government. The real government has the support of the people and is aligned with the military who will protect that rule. And this is important. So Brazilian police last week accused Bolsonaro and 36 of his allies of plotting a coup to stop Da Silva from taking office after Bolsonaro narrowly lost the 2022 election. The allegations included plans to assassinate the leftist leader. Did they? Did they? The charges stem from a January 28th, 2023, or January 8th, 2023 uprising in which several thousand Bolsonaro supporters stormed the presidential palace, Congress, and the Supreme Court in Brasilia before police fended them off. So 2-year delta almost to the day of our very violent insurrection, their very violent insurrection, January 8th. Brazil's electoral court has also effectively banned him from running in the next presidential election. Okay? The court ruled last year that he had undermined confidence in the country's electoral system by accusing Da Silva of stealing the 2022 election without presenting sufficient evidence. I mean, this is the exact same playbook. Bolsonaro denies any wrongdoing, saying he's victim of a witch hunt by Da Silva and left-leaning judges. They don't just want me in jail, they want me dead. And he lifted his shirt to show a giant scar because they stabbed him in 2018. There's Lula. Bolsonaro plans to register his candidacy ahead of the 2026 vote, despite the ban, he said, banking on pressure from Trump on Brazil's judges to delay enforcement of the 2023 ruling just long enough for him to run. The former Brazilian army officer suggested that Trump could level economic sanctions against Da Silva's government to help him. As long as the electoral court doesn't turn down my registration, it's valid, Bolsonaro said. They can just put it off as long as possible until the election is over. Well, how about that? It's almost like the bodies that are invalidating his legitimacy and his opportunity to run again can simply be bypassed, just as they can here. There's an actual, and there's the false reality layer. The false reality layer does not matter. Skipping through this kind of quickly. Brazil's right has also lobbied Trump to withdraw the U.S. visa of Brazilian Supreme Court Justice Alexandra de Moraes, who has led sweeping criminal investigations into Bolsonaro and his allies, a request that is viewed favorably by parts of the incoming U.S. administration, according to people close to the situation. Now, de Moraes is the guy that has gone back and forth with Elon Musk on X, formerly Twitter, over X, formerly Twitter, and Starlink satellites for information, for the access to information from for Brazil's people. Now, this is the very violent insurrection of January 8th, 2023 in Brazil. Look how extremely violent it is. This is the stuff with Elon Musk. De Moraes and his supporters say a tough approach is necessary in a country that returned to democracy from military rule 4 decades ago. Our democracy. Others, including some legal scholars, have accused him of judicial overreach. In a recent report spanning nearly 900 pages detailing their investigation into the January 8th attacks, police accused Bolsonaro of overseeing a criminal conspiracy to stop Da Silva from taking office. Bolsonaro denies that he acted outside the limits of the Constitution. He said that he did no more than question the result of an election that he believed was unfair, arguing he sought to rein in hot-headed supporters. They laid into me, he said, of his most defiant supporters, calling me a coward. And there are those in fake MAGA who were similarly upset at Donald Trump for stepping away from power when they did not believe he had to. All right, a couple more here. So let's go to Venezuela. And this is El País, the Spanish outlet, translated into English. Nicolas Maduro offers Trump his experience in security to combat crime. How about that? Nicolas Maduro, the authoritarian, we are told, communist dictator of Venezuela, is going to help out Donald Trump defeat crime. This is from today. Okay, there's Maduro. Look how evil. Nicolas Maduro has offered the United States his experience in combating crime to improve internal security, one of the main concerns of President-elect Donald Trump. Maduro's message occurs at a time of uncertainty about what kind of relationship the Chavista government can expect with the incoming White House administration, especially in the context of the crisis in Venezuela following the presidential ballot of July 28th, in which Chavismo claims a victory that the international community refuses to recognize due to suspicions of large-scale electoral fraud. And in truth, they have created those suspicions. Those suspicions are only supported by exit polling done by Edison Research. Exit polling, not even real fake polling. It's just exit polling where they say, yeah, we asked everybody as they were coming out from voting what they thought. Oh, man. The Venezuelan president, where did I go? Way too far. The Venezuelan president explained during his television program, Con Maduro, that he tried to reach such an agreement with the Biden administration, but received no response. This government did not want to work seriously. I made the proposal to this government to work on the issue. We're going to coordinate to be able to combat criminal gangs. With the experience that we have, in which we have achieved a great space for peace and coexistence, freed Venezuela from these criminal gangs, we can work with the government of the United States and American society in a climate of cooperation for peace and internal security. We have always had that will, and we still have it, he said. So he's going to help the United States with its criminal gang problem from Central and South America, because leaders like Maduro have cured their problems and the remaining ones have escaped to America, where they serve the same interests that they were always serving as CIA global regime proxies that could destabilize nations. Same thing here. Run drug cartels, run drug rings, introduce drugs into societies, introduce crime into societies, and provide a great excuse for hitmen and murders, targeted murders. They just say, oh no, it's actually a gang. Trump's current position on Venezuela remains unknown. In his first term as president, the real estate magnate promoted a parallel president to Maduro, Juan Guaido, a diplomatic adventure that was unsuccessful. Trump has been very critical of Chavismo in public, but according to one of his advisors in private, he often praises Maduro for being a strongman in the authoritarian manner that the president-elect admires and that he sees reflected in other world leaders such as Vladimir Putin and Turkey's Erdogan. According to a report by the Wall Street Journal, oil businessmen in his inner circle are urging him to reach agreements with Maduro to take advantage of the country's enormous crude oil reserves and, in the process, deport hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans who have entered the United States in recent years. How about that? They're admitting the illegal alien problem. They're suggesting that Donald Trump will be able to reach an agreement that the fake President Joe Biden was not able to reach. And all of that is going to involve oil reserves, and specifically in Guyana, and a potential undercover alliance between Trump and Maduro that would seem to go counter to Trump's comments. So is Donald Trump coordinating with an authoritarian communist dictator, as we are told he does with China and Russia, but we know to be bullshit? Or are all the base and red-pilled influencers who are just trying to grovel before Elon Musk while celebrating Venezuela's BLM Antifa movement just wrong about geopolitics that they know nothing about? I would suggest to you that it is the second one. And for all the people who told me that I was supporting an authoritarian communist dictator while saying exactly this about Nicolas Maduro, while people were claiming that he had stolen his election, I don't know what to tell you guys. Sorry. I guess maybe there's a better way to look at the world than assuming which version of the mainstream media story you like the best and then just pretending to virtue signal that you are against communism. People are retarded, man. Maduro in this line has extended a hand to Trump. To anyone in the U.S. who is concerned about this issue modestly, in Venezuela, we have good experience. In 2025, as Diosdado says, We are already in better shape to give all the criminal and extortionist gangs a beating. We will advance even further to give peace and security to Venezuelans. Diosdado Cabello, Minister of the Interior and de facto the second most powerful person in the country after Maduro, attributes the decrease in crime in Venezuela to the good work of the security forces. Violent deaths decreased in 2022 and 2023. Criminal gangs are linked to a destabilization plan that involved assaulting prisons. Thanks to God and to military, popular, and police intelligence, we are 3 steps ahead, Maduro added. Now, will we see something like this being necessary to combat the elements of the global communist regime right here in the United States, including criminal drug gangs? Probably. However, an investigation by the regional NGO Insight Crime, and a big however. So now is when we hear the global regime's viewpoint turned back against Maduro. The investigation points out that this reduction is due, among other reasons, to the mass migration that Venezuela has experienced in the last 5 years, in which it estimated that more than 5 million people have left the country. Recession in Venezuela has led criminal gangs like the Tren de Aragua, Yeco massacre, and the Melian to infiltrate Venezuelan diasporas settled in other Latin American countries, says the report from the think tank. Okay, so the separation from the global regime currency will always create, and this is just one of those unfortunate necessities. This may have already happened to a large degree in 2020. And we're going to see on an informational timeline adjustment at some point in the future that is the case. I believe, okay, that is my opinion. It might have to happen again. Regardless of whether it is the Great Awakening and a separation from the global fiat banking system, or it is just a factor of the global regime, the global Great Reset that is disguised as good for us, the currency is going to have to be brought down because the regime fiat currency has already failed and collapsed. And so when that happens, interests that are heavily dependent on the global regime fiat currency and everything that it is able to do in society are going to themselves collapse. That would be very, very bad, depending on how attached you are to the global regime's fiat currency and whether you have protected yourself and diversified and prepared for the fact that the regime's fiat currency is collapsing. Now, if there is some save for the US dollar, and I hope there is, and I believe there to be, and it's probably going to be pinned to Bitcoin, in my estimation, then it's possible to save the dollar and thus save some people's investments in the dollar. But if you are in banking and you have your businesses all tied up in the regime agenda, you're going to have a very hard time. And drainage is going to cover a lot of that. And I think we're going to have something like proof of burn that is going to take regime fiat currency out of the global money supply, okay? And eliminate the fiat layer, the false reality layer on top of whatever that base layer is. Okay. But that adjustment, whoever is experiencing that adjustment and experiencing the drainage that it will entail, well, those people are going to be experiencing a recession. And if you are an economist who's going to take all of that into account while ignoring the causes of that recession in those certain sectors for those entities and for those people, well, then you're just going to declare that there's an economic recession overall and that the authoritarian dictator has destroyed the economy. And to understand that that is going to happen here means that we can export that idea to other countries and consider whether or not that is going to happen or has already happened in Venezuela. And that is why we are told that they are eating the dogs and eating the cats and eating the pets of the people that live there in order to have enough food to survive. All right, so let's go back to this article. And I'll put it back up on the screen because I realized that I may have had that down longer than I thought. Maduro also made reference to the demonstration called by the opposition in Caracas last Sunday, which had little power to attract supporters. How about that? So there is not actually an opposition. There is just a story of an opposition. The opposition candidate who apparently beat the Venezuelan president in the July elections, Edmundo González Urrutia, currently in exile in Spain, stated days earlier that on January 10th, 2025, the date of the inauguration of the new president, he would be in Caracas to take office. Edmundo, if you are not capable of going to a march in Madrid right next to the palace where you are living, will you be capable of coming to Venezuela? How far are they going to take their show? You will end up in the garbage dump of history, Maduro concluded. Now, Donald Trump could have taken that approach to Joe Biden and chose not to. Instead, he allowed the regime to prop up their fake president and allowed him to at least ostensibly and optically serve out his 4-year term in office. Does that mean that Joe Biden was actually a real president? No, it does not. And there is no point at which Edmundo Gonzalez Urrutia will be a real president of Venezuela. Will they continue to play out this clown show and try to convince the world that Urrutia is the real president? They might. Will Maduro allow that to happen? I doubt it, but could it happen? Could they do a Venezuelan devolution show as they've done in America and in Brazil? I don't know. Maybe they could. We'll see. I'm not privy to those kinds of decisions, obviously, but we can look clearly at the pattern and we can recognize it for what it is. We don't need to pretend that there's not something else going on here just because it sounds kind of crazy to some people. I mean, look at what's happening in Brazil. How could something like that happen unless intentionally? And so then the question only becomes, who is intending for this to happen? Who is running this info op? Is it an info op by the good guys? Or is it an info op by the bad guys? And, that's going to be ultimately something that people kind of have to decide for themselves. But real hard to see how it could be something other than for the good guys, unless Trump and all of these guys are just also playing us so that we can all be dog walked into that great reset. And, at some point, it's just a matter of, pardon me, a matter of faith on one side or the other. And all belief creation at bottom has to run into faith. There is no evidence from the real world that you can point to and say, this evidence is conclusive that this is a good guy or this is a bad guy. That's not really how it works. And the same is true of the claims of science, of course, though we are convinced to pretend that is not true. Now, I'm going to conclude on this issue today, go through a couple things here. There has apparently been martial law declared in South Korea. South Korea, it should be said before anything else, is a global regime proxy state that probably does not exist. The Korean War has never ended. The global regime essentially occupied half of Korea and has stayed there for 70 plus years. And we talked about this in an episode called, I think I called it something like Summer Instagram Date or something. Summer Instagram Bromance, okay? June 21st, 2024. In that episode, we talk about the little rocket man and Vladimir Putin having a picnic and a tea party and driving around, giving each other gifts, horses and cars and whatnot, and taking all their pictures for the gram so that they could win cutest couple. And gosh, I don't remember where I was going with that. But this video, sorry, I was looking at this video and it's just so funny that it's almost distracting. Let's just take a look at this. Oh, yes. This is what I was saying. We were talking about the Korean War and how it had never actually ended. Okay. And there was no resolution, no treaty. It's just ongoing. The same as World War II never ended. And so there is we talked in that episode about the potential for resolution and Donald Trump's role in crossing the demilitarized zone and bringing North Korea and South Korea together in hopes of resolving this conflict. And I think we'll see over the next few years, the reunification of Korea into a whole, or maybe not. Maybe it will just be two states. But if it is two states, it will be without the global regime's involvement in the affairs of South Korea. Okay. And Russia and North Korea are actually neighboring countries, though they don't, for whatever reason, perceptually seem like it. And we can see the alignment of Vladimir Putin and North Korea, which is essentially a tell on the emergence of the multipolar world order and potentially the sovereign alliance. Donald Trump has some relationship with Kim Jong-un, Little Rocket Man, who we are told is the most dangerous man in the entire world. This is, we are not told that about South Korea's president. This is President Yoon at the fake White House with the fake president, Joe Biden, in April of last year, singing karaoke.
We know this is one of your favorite songs, American Pie.
American Pie가 가장 좋아하는 곡 중에 하나시라고 들었습니다. Yes, that's true. Yes, when I was going to school, it was one of my favorite songs.
Well, we wanted to hear you sing it.
It's been a while, but.
A long, long time ago, I can still remember how that music used to make me smile. And now I knew if I had my chains, that I could make those people dance, and maybe they'd be happy for a while. A February made me shiver, with the paper I deliver. Bad news on the doorstep. I couldn't take one more step. I can't remember if I tried when I read about his widow bride. Something touched me deep inside the day the music died.
There's a fellow who wrote that song, Miss American Pie, that couldn't be here tonight.
노래를 쓰신 분이 있죠.
But he wanted you to have his signed guitar.
그분의 사인이 들어 있습니다.
Don McLean. You know?
Don McLean이다.
So how about that? The fake president is with Yoon, and he is singing Bye Bye Miss American Pie at the fake White House. I mean, maybe that's the real White House. Kind of doubt it, but maybe it is. The real White House is also the fake White House right now, because the real White House is actually the winter White House down in Florida. Okay, let's go to the events of the day. This is from regime mouthpiece Reuters. South Korea troops try to storm parliament after martial law declared. Troops were seen trying to enter the South Korean parliament on Wednesday after President Yoon Suk-yeol declared martial law in a surprise late-night TV address that slammed domestic political opponents and sent shockwaves through the country. Live television footage showed troops apparently tasked with imposing martial law attempting to enter the assembly building, and parliamentary aides were seen trying to push the soldiers back by spraying fire extinguishers. That sounds like a color revolution to me. Yoon said, getting defenseless people to get security forces to enact violence against them so that you can see security forces enacting violence against the defenseless is part of the color revolution playbook. Yoon said on Tuesday night that the opposition parties had taken, and again, opposition parties is always a cue for regime forces. Sorry, let's get back to that. Yoon said on Tuesday night that opposition parties had taken the parliamentary process hostage. He vowed to eradicate shameless pro-North Korean anti-state forces and said he had no choice but to take the measure to safeguard constitutional order. So these forces are Little Rocket Man's forces. These are the pro-communist forces. These are trying to take down South Korea's democracy. So Yoon is putting these forces out. He's declaring martial law against the little rocket man. That's the important thing to remember. At least that's what we're being told, right? Shortly after Yoon made his announcement, people began gathering outside the parliament building, some of them shouting, "Withdraw emergency martial law." Ah, yes. The protest movement is immediately on the scene, saying, "You can't do this. You can't do this." The military said activities by parliament and political parties would be banned, and that the media and publishers would be under the control of the martial law command. Yoon did not cite any specific threat from the nuclear-armed North, instead focusing on his domestic political opponents, the opposition, okay? The domestic political opponents, the opposition. Always, in all the international crisis group stuff, in Venezuela, in all of these countries we can study, the opposition is always what the pro-regime forces and people are described, the candidates, etc., the party. That's how they're described by the regime media. South Korea has had a series of authoritarian leaders in its early history, but has been considered democratic since the 1980s. Oh, same as Brazil. The Korean won was down sharply against the US dollar. A central bank official said it was preparing measures to stabilize the market if needed. Finance Minister Choi Sang-mok has convened an emergency meeting among top economic officials. Isn't that incredible? It's almost like something is happening with South Korea's currency relative to the global regime. Let me find out. I've seen some hints about this morning. Let me see if there's anything more conclusive about that. I think they may be is South Korea considering joining BRICS? The authoritative opinion of AI, and that is said tongue-in-cheek, is that they're not currently considering joining BRICS, but they are exploring potentially joining BRICS in the future. Are they considering? Let's see here. Relevant developments related to SWIFT and South Korea. South Korea's Kookmin Bank will cease processing SWIFT transfers in US dollars for banks starting September 2024. Isn't that incredible? This decision is attributed to expanding sanctions and stricter regulatory requirements imposed by Western countries, but it does not indicate South Korea's intention to leave SWIFT. So there's some movement there. I would suspect that that indication is probably going to grow in signal over the coming days. And if that is the case, I think you can pretty much assume that the declarations of martial law would be directly related to that. And when I was kind of doing some background on this morning, the conversation about martial law in South Korea seems to have sparked up in September of this year, which might indicate some relation between that story and the timeline for martial law here. Yoon's predecessor, Moon Jae-in of the Democratic Party, said in a post on X that the country's democracy is in crisis. I hope that the National Assembly will act quickly to protect our democracy from crumbling. And that's honestly like people like Hillary Clinton and Liz Cheney saying the same thing about Donald Trump. Oh, he's threatening democracy. They're threatening democracy. Everyone is always threatening democracy. These are all signals that are much more valuable than reading the literal words of the media outlets disseminating. These are actual signals, okay? Regime mouthpiece Reuters, totally aligned with the regime, communicating the words of the former president about the country's democracy in crisis, hoping that the anti-Yoon forces will win the day, that's signal. The United States is in contact with the South Korean government and is monitoring the situation closely, a White House spokesperson said. Some 28,500 U.S. troops are stationed in South Korea to guard against the North. A spokesman for the U.S. military command did not answer repeated phone calls. Now, that sounds, to my ear, like a 7-decade-long military occupation. We're told, oh, they're just stabilizing the region. That is not what we would think it was if someone was stabilizing our region. Donald Trump has not posted about this yet. I always look to Trump to see if he's giving some signal, because usually he will make strong pro-regime statements before completely reversing those statements. And I expect that we will see that here in the next few hours. Maybe not, obviously, but I expect that might be what we see. The BBC has been, I'm going to actually refresh this screen. They've been covering the moment by moment. This is what we're getting from all the major news outlets. Oh, this is a situation in flux. Oh, we got to show the protesters. South Korea lawmakers defy president and block martial law as crowds protest. And so let's just read through the summary here. Then we'll get into some of those details. South Korea's President Yoon Suk-yeol has declared emergency martial law, which he says is necessary to protect the country from North Korea's communist forces and to eliminate anti-state elements. Lawmakers have since voted to block the president's move after both the ruling party and opposition vowed to obstruct the declaration. Protests have been taking place outside Parliament, with the BBC's Jake Kwan hearing chants of no to martial law as police sirens ring out. So there you have it. The regime media is on the ground letting us know that the people do not want this martial law. Yoon's People Power Party and the opposition Democratic Party have been locked in dispute over next year's budget bill. Martial law means rule by military authorities in a time of emergency and can mean the suspension of normal civil rights. Yoon is mired in controversy and has been a lame duck president since the last election, writes Jake Kwan Seol. So you see that they're trying to diminish Yoon's legitimacy without saying he is illegitimate. He's just been a lame duck president. He doesn't have the presidential powers that normal presidents would have. And therefore, if he exercises them, he is somehow going beyond the bounds of his mandate. That is not true in the United States when the mandate is clearly expressed. And despite his illegitimacy, Joe Biden and his administration are allowed to do whatever it is they want, still potentially only at threat of the 25th Amendment in a narrative sense, of course. Now, it's funny to me that the lawmakers have voted unanimously, by the way. I believe it was, it goes right down to it. Well, it didn't help. There it is. All 190 lawmakers present vote to lift martial law. So the other 110, apparently were not there. All present were in favor. Members of the ruling and the opposition parties. Isn't that interesting? So even some members of Yoon's own party voted against it. National Assembly Speaker Woo Won-sik submitted a resolution requesting the lifting of martial law around 1 local time. Okay? So they are voting against the martial law imposed ostensibly to go against North Korea. What is the statement? What should we take from this? Has the parliament and has the opposition been wrapped around the axle, so to speak, where they run over and then they just keep flopping under the car? They are shutting down martial law declared to be in opposition of Little Rocket Man Kim Jong-un. Is that what's happening? Because if that's what's happening, that is awfully interesting. We are continuing to watch with grave concern, and we will continue to follow developments on the ground very closely. Vedant Patel, U.S. State Department spokesperson, continues. Patel is also asked about Yoon's assessment that martial law was necessary to protect the country from pro-North Korea forces. He says there's, quote, a long litany of reckless actions, end quote, carried out by North Korea, but it's not up to the U.S. to, quote, draw those kinds of conclusions in relation to current events. So the illegitimate administration is unable to make any conclusive declaration about whether or not the martial law was declared to oppose North Korea. So it's possible, from the U.S. State Department's point of view, that martial law was declared not against North Korea, and instead what? Against the opposition elements, the regime elements in South Korea? It seems like those members of parliament and the regime media are suggesting that martial law was actually declared to tamp down the rights and the will of the people by a lame duck president. But he says he's doing it to deal with North Korea. If he's doing it to deal with North Korea, then the parliament and the regime media are in a bit of a bind, because that would mean that they are actually doing something pro-North Korea, despite telling us for decades, years about Kim Jong-un, decades for the Kims and for North Korea, despite telling us that they are ruled by an authoritarian communist dictator who is oppressing all of his people and destroying the country. We've been told that for an awfully long time. Donald Trump, the first to make peace with Little Rocket Man, we were told that Little Rocket Man was going to fire nukes at the United States of America. There was even the scare, the emergency broadcast signal in Hawaii about all of that, you might remember. But no war with North Korea ever happened. How could it possibly be so? And here we have finally the developing situation. So I say finally, but certainly not the be all and end all of the story. But this is globalnews.ca. I think this is Canadian Global News by Reuters staff. Okay. So this is still the mouthpiece of the regime. Read the full text of South Korea's martial law decree. Here's the full text, Reuters translation of the military decree. So this is what Yoon said, translated by the global media. Now, we can assume, give them the benefit of the doubt, though there's never really a reason, but let's just assume that they're not going to lie about something like this. It's possible that they will manipulate the translation to give us a different impression on elements of what Yoon said. But since I don't speak Korean, I am unable to resolve that problem if there is one. So we can hope there is not one and understand that however small the possibility, there is still a possibility that something important is lost in translation. So let's just do this quickly. This is Yoon's statement. In order to protect liberal democracy from the threat of overthrowing the regime of the Republic of Korea by anti-state forces active within the Republic of Korea, and to protect the safety of the people, the following is hereby declared throughout the Republic of Korea as of 11 p.m. on December 3rd, 2024. And he says 23 o'clock. All political activities, including the activities of the National Assembly, local councils, and political parties, political associations, rallies, and demonstrations are prohibited. So they violated that prohibition. 190 of those members of parliament went in violating that prohibition and then voted that there was no martial law. Okay. And we are told that the security forces are attempting to shut down their illegitimate or quasi-legitimate parliamentary procedure. And so that some of that is just going to be in the eyes of the beholder and something that we're going to have to hash out later. It is worth always remembering that all that has to happen here is you need the opposition in parliament to combine with the elements of their uniparty, get some of Yoon's own party members, including that speaker, to introduce this resolution and then back the resolution and then affirm that Yoon is declaring martial law in this manner and then have security forces filmed as arriving and some conflict. And you basically have a very violent insurrection story that you can tell the world and say Yoon is systematically oppressing the government and the people of Korea violently to hold on to power or whatever it is. Number 2, all acts that deny or attempt to overthrow the liberal democratic system are prohibited, and fake news, public opinion manipulation, and false propaganda are prohibited. All media and publications are subject to the control of the martial law command. Strikes, work stoppages, and rallies that incite social chaos are prohibited. All medical personnel, including trainee doctors who are on strike or have left the medical field, must return to their jobs within 48 hours and work faithfully. Those who violate will be punished in accordance with the martial law. And I obviously don't know this. I haven't dug on that particular element, but it seems as though there was probably some opposition effort to stage a strike and walkout of medical workers going along with their influence on labor, as always. This goes back at least 100 years in regime, color revolutions, and overthrows of government. Innocent, ordinary citizens, including anti-state forces and other subversive forces, will be subject to measures to minimize inconvenience in their daily lives. Violators of the above proclamation may be arrested, detained, and searched without a warrant in accordance with Article 9 of the Martial Law Act of the Republic of Korea. Special measures, authority of the martial law commander, and will be punished in accordance with Article 14 of the Martial Law Act. Penalties. Martial law commander, Army General Park On-soo, Tuesday, December 3rd, 2024. So the declaration of martial law essentially hands things over to a military government. And the idea here being that the parliament could then vote that there is no martial law, which would make the military government look illegitimate. Now, you got to understand that I think a much better way to analyze these events, though we are not on the ground in Korea, and we know that we are in a zero trust informational space through the fog of war and whatever else. It is my belief that it is best to look at these patterns as they keep playing out worldwide, understanding the elements of the color revolution and the elements fighting back that color revolution as we've seen it in all these other countries. This might be a preview of what we are to see in the future in America, which is why we are being shown this story playing out to begin with. I want to see if the Republic of Korea includes North Korea. And it's funny because the Perplexity just suggested, I wrote, does the Republic of Korea, and it suggested include North Korea. Amazing. The Republic of Korea, commonly known as South Korea, does not include North Korea. The Korean Peninsula is divided into two separate sovereign states. And of course, this is from the point of view of the regime, the same way that they would say Ukraine is a sovereign state and Taiwan is a sovereign state and Guyana is a sovereign state and Hong Kong is a sovereign state and blah, blah, blah. Doesn't matter. And it doesn't matter because this is not how things actually work. And power is going to do what power does. And the emergence of the multipolar world order is going to continue forward no matter what the papers at the United Nations and some lines on some maps say, because that stuff doesn't matter. Those are abstractions. Those are very weak abstractions of power or very weak displays of abstract power. They hold up not at all in relation to the projection of real power. And speaking of which, it's kind of funny, you know, Lowry is just using this as an illustration today, but Jason Lowry, who wrote Soft War, posted this on X, formerly Twitter, today as a very good illustration of abstract versus real power. Writing real power versus abstract power and highlighting this exact article from, what was that, Reuters or the Associated Press? I can't even remember. I can't remember, even though it was 5 minutes ago. So real versus abstract power. Perplexity says this: both nations emerged from the division of Korea after World War II, which was intended to be temporary, but resulted in a permanent split following the Korean War that ended in an armistice, not a peace treaty. Consequently, both governments continue to assert their legitimacy over all of Korea, leading to ongoing tensions between them. The two Koreas are separated by a heavily fortified border known as the Korean Demilitarized Zone. Okay. And they are still working to resolve that, as noted in that June podcast, Summer Instagram Bromance. Will we see the uniting of the two Koreas? Will we see a two-state solution that nonetheless does not include the global regime? Perhaps we might see some sort of operation akin to what we have witnessed in Israel and Palestine over the last 15 months, 14 months. All of these things are possible. What I believe is highly unlikely is that Yoon is declaring martial law to violently oppress the people of Korea. I find that, and I am going to find similarly hard to believe all of the explanations and stories we are told by regime media over the rest of today and potentially tomorrow about what all this is meant to mean. Okay. That stuff is not going to mean very much. It is always better to look at these things through the lens of the good twin, evil twin paradigm, which is far more relevant than descriptions like communist or democracy or fascist or authoritarian or dictator or any of the rest of it. It makes no sense to look at the country as a whole. Oh, this is South Korea, the country, against North Korea. The word opposition is signal. All of these things are signal. Do not listen to the based and red-pilled influencers on X, formerly Twitter, as they try to win social media points from Elon Musk in their ridiculous interpretations of geopolitical affairs. We saw them failing and flailing with Venezuela, with Ukraine, with Israel, with every single geopolitical event so far. Their interpretation and analysis has been useless in terms of projecting future events. It has been useless in understanding the tone and tenor of media coverage, where any of these things are going, where Donald Trump will ultimately come down on the issues. So throw it all out. It is useless and worthless. Now, does that leave only me and only Badlands Media and only, some handful of whatever other content creators, reporters, journalists, etc. you all follow? Yeah, probably. That's the information space we're in. People don't take it seriously. And that is to their own detriment, in my mind. The mainstream media and the analysis off of mainstream media, like the Daily Weimar, like Tucker Carlson, like Dan Bongino, have provided virtually no insight on any relevant timeline into geopolitical affairs. And to the extent that I am right about that, and I believe I am wholly right about that, but to that extent, they should be ignored. Why would you bother listening to people who don't know anything about what's going on? Or if they do know anything about what's going on, they refuse to tell you about it on any timeline that might allow you to properly analyze things for yourself. It is ridiculous and a problem. And with that, I am going to wrap up. Tomorrow, it is my intent, barring any weather, and I'm in a place that has weather. Barring any of that, it is my intent to be doing the subscriber live stream at 1 p.m. Eastern. And I will be announcing that, obviously, as I always do, through a Substack notification and on Telegram and Truth Social. So it is my expectation that for paid subscribers to the podcast, to the Substack, I'm your moderator.substack.com. I will be seeing you at 1 p.m. Eastern tomorrow. I will be off on Thursday and Friday, resuming the normal show in some variety on Monday. And with that, I expect I will be back tomorrow at the same reasonable time on the same reasonable podcast network. I do not have a network. Masks and lockdowns don't work. They lied to you about a pandemic, and Joe Biden will never be president.
Well,
what?
You know who I am, don't you?
Well, you ain't Fiona Apple, and if you ain't Fiona Apple, I don't give a rat's ass.
Ah!
You down.
We do a little trolling. It's called We Do a Little Trolling.
What?
In my mind, that's the end game.
If you're listening for free and would like to support the show, the best way to do that is by signing up for a paid subscription at imyourmoderator.substack.com. You can find the info stream over on Telegram at t.me/veryreasonable. The merch site is cancelcouture.com, and for all my other links, you can visit linktree.com/imyourmoderator. And I'll see you soon. Down on the range.